All right, guys, welcome back to part 2 of the build series here on this Dancing Wings Pt17 Stearman from Bitgo Hobby. Tons of tips and tricks coming up. Stick around. In the next step, it's time to start to prepare the ailerons. And we're going to do these exactly like we did the rudder and like we did the elevators. Again, trying to minimize this hinge gap down. So again, we're going to be using the drill bit trick to go ahead and set those hinges. We have 2 of these to do, and then we will start to work on getting servos installed in there. Let's get to it. All right, now it's time to go ahead and install the 2 aileron servos. We're going to center them using this, and then we will find what arm fits best. When you go to assemble your servos, you're just going to take these little grommets. You're going to stick them in the holes. If we can get them in there. Once those things are in there, you put the brass fitting through the back side like that. We're going to do all 4. That'll give us a place to put our servo screws. Now, my personal preference, I just do not like these attachment screws with Phillips. I have some Allen head ones that I'll be using. I like those a lot better than these, simply because of a positive drive. So I never use servo screws with the Phillips head. Now, the blocks they give you, you're going to have to cut in half. And the reason for that is this servo takes up almost this whole bay area. And if you use the whole block, it hangs over. So you're going to have to cut this in half like this. And then you're going to have to install that thing. Now, what I'll do is I'll put this horn on here. Like that, for example. And then I want that centered in the opening like that. And once that thing is centered, I will center the servo, and then I will mark that location and epoxy those in there. Now, another word of advice: when you go to put in those servo screw holes, make sure you drill pilots and then wick that whole thing full of CA to make it hard, so that way those servos don't pull out of there. All right, now we have those blocks. They're completely wicked with CA, and we're going to go ahead and install our servos. And again, I'm changing the hardware here, and I'm going to use these hex drives. Now, these servo screws that I am using here come from RTL Fasteners. You can actually pick them up over there at rtlfasteners.com. They come in a bunch of different lengths, really cool. But if you guys are interested in ordering from RTL, do me a favor, use code JPC30. So that stands for Just Plain Crazy 30, and that will save you 30% off any order over 50 bucks. So that saves you a good bit of cash. So you can find these things and lots of other type of airplane fasteners, different assortments of things. You can find all that stuff at rtlfasteners.com. And again, Just Plain Crazy 30. So you're going to use code JPC30. And these things, look how positive that is. And I'm not worried about stripping these things out and dealing with, you know, goofy Phillips head screws. This is just the one area that I just can't stand to use a Phillips head screw. And these things have worked phenomenally for me since the beginning of time of building airplanes. But let's go ahead and get all of these put in, and then center up our servo arm. So we have our servos mounted in the hatches, and I have them on the longer end. So this one is actually here, and then also matching on the other side. So we have our Allen sockets there, we have our set screws installed, and then I am using these pieces here for the push rods that they included in the kit, and I did use a thread locker a little bit on that thread there, so that way that thing doesn't come loose. Now, when you go to install these things, we're going to do the same thing, and we're going to wick some CA into all those ears right there for a little bit extra strength. We don't want any of that stuff pulling out. And these are all the little things that, you know, when you have successful maiden, and, you know, planes stay around for 10, 15, 20, 30 years, all these little things are why. You know, these are all the things that you do to a model when you build it to prevent failures or, you know, lessons learned the hard way. So we don't repeat them, but that way it just increases the durability of the model. Once that hardens up, then we're going to go ahead and install our servos. Now, as far as the leads go, when we put these in, these look to be just long enough to come through the other side, which will be perfect. Now, the last thing that we're going to do here before we let this stuff all sit overnight is we're going to install the control horns on the aileron. So don't forget, you need to rough those up. You can see where I sanded that stuff down. There's holes in there for grip. I taped this off because I am going to use a overnight epoxy. Anytime I do horns, it's not a fast setting, it is a slow setting epoxy. And when you put in horns, whatever hole you're using should be right on the hinge line. And what I do is I use a laser to make sure that, if you guys can see how that would come over, I go right down the hinge line and make sure that that hole is right there on it, and that will give you equal deflection in each direction. So we're going to go ahead, the ears have now hardened up. We're going to install the servos in there and get that done, and we're going to epoxy those in. And one of the other reasons I tape that off is because I will go in there with a just a toothpick like this, and then or a popsicle stick, I should say, and then just make fillets around the edges, let it sit for probably about 10 minutes to semi-harden, and then I peel the tape off. And that leaves you a nice clean look all the way around that thing. But let's go ahead and install those, and then we're done for the night. All right, our horns have finished drying overnight, and our hinges, gave them things a really good pull test here. Those things are all locked into place. Now, here's a little tidbit. If you're worried about that foaming out around that hinge coming out and getting on your covering, there's a really simple fix to that. You can just use the back side, the unsharpened side of the blade, and just scrape on the covering, and that stuff will come right off, or a light smear of Vaseline or something on there, and then it'll never stick. It'll pop right off. But it's never been a big issue for me. Remember, the stuff does expand, and it takes up space really easily, so you don't need a super ton of it. Now we're going to go ahead and install our push rods. We have our servo centering device, tool, gizmo. That's all set up. Servo is in the center. Now, a couple things that I did here. Number one, these clevises have some play. So I just used a metric nut here, and we'll take the play out of that as a jam nut, and that'll keep those threads from getting worn out from having slop in there. And also, I've never really been a fan of the heat shrink, but I did try to use theirs, and it doesn't work. It doesn't shrink down enough, and I did that, as you can see on this one. So I did trial and error on this one. So what I'm doing here is just taking a piece of silicone fuel tube, and we'll place that over this end first, like that. We will latch this onto here and put that through that little device right there, that keeper, and make sure that that's all centered up right here. And then this is where, guys, the book falls apart a little bit. So they show you, once you're done with this step, into the next step to start to mark these little carbon pieces that go into the upper part of the wing here, the center part. Well, all that stuff's in, and there's no place in here except for over here to start putting that in. So yes, you can do this on the bench. I'm just going to jump over to here and I'm going to get those 4 pieces locked in. My centerpiece locked in to start getting some stuff off my bench, and then we'll start to mark those pieces. Let's get to it. You're going to see me use these easy connectors throughout this build. I change my mind before this thing ever leaves the layer, and stick around towards the end. I'm going to show you why, but definitely the easy connectors got to go. Now, we had our wing supports. We have those installed. A couple notes. I had to trim a little bit of the wood at each bottom edge. I thought that would be easier than trimming off the aluminum to get those to fit. That took a second, not a big deal. And when you install these, make sure you install them with all the holes on the top side. Now, after trial fitting that those would fit in the bottom, I did find it considerably easier to install these center section supports into this wing first, and then just kind of spread them a little bit and to place them on here. Make sure that your holes are in the top side. Now we'll install those screws. All right, guys, in the next couple steps, there is a lot going on here, and we're going to try and do it hopefully all at once with some slow curing epoxy, and hopefully this all works out really well for us. So first off, we installed in our carbon tubes. The longer one goes up front, the shorter one goes into the bottom. Now we have to start to glue in our wing attachment points to the inside of all the wings. Now in this step, we're going to go ahead and we're going to set the depth on all of these tabs. Now to do this, the first step you want to do is insert the tab actually into the spot where the thumb screw is. Once you have that piece there, you'll go ahead and install the thumb screw into the bottom to hold it, and then we're going to mark the outside of that black piece. That way you know the line on the depth, so that way you don't have issues getting a thumb screw in on how far to set that in, and then they're epoxied into this place up to that line. Now what I found by doing it this way, I had to take this piece back out. This piece is about that much too long. So what's happening is if you just set this in here, when you put this in, this actually bottoms out against something in the wing, and it is not letting the front part of the wing sit up here against that saddle, just the back. And that doesn't support anything and doesn't help the alignment. So we have to trim these and put this all back in here together again, but it's still not a big deal. Let's get to cutting. On the insides, we also have to epoxy in all of these metal plates. And again, they have circles, so the epoxy will go through there on the inside in the wing and kind of grip that. But I do want to rough up around those holes, only on the part that is going to be hidden into the wing. And all 4 of these, maybe 8 of these, I guess, because it's on both wing panels, we want to tape that around so I don't get any epoxy on the covering. But there's some wiggle room in there, so I don't just want to blindly put those in and say that it's good. The nice part about slow cure high sol epoxy is it doesn't run. It is thicker. And what we are going to do is, once everything is sanded, buffed, ready to install, I'm going to epoxy everything all at one time, and I'm going to insert everything all at one time, and I'm going to hook it all up here on the plane all at one time, except for gluing in the 4 anchor points of this wing, because that's what these things were for that I couldn't figure out in the unboxing. These things help to set your wings in place, and you use rubber bands wrapped around the wing. So if I can get everything secured on this plane and in place and let that stuff dry overnight, I will be ecstatic with where we are at this plane at this point. Now, a couple other things to talk about. These are the thumb screws for the upper wing. In my opinion, they're going to fall out. So what I did is inserted just a small piece of, again, fuel tubing on there, and that'll help those lock into place. Also, they do not talk about, you can catch a glimpse of it in the picture if you're careful, carbon tubes. There are 2 carbon tubes they're in this bag with all of the flying wire braces. These things actually get slid over to lower wing thumb screws, and you don't want to miss that. Again, these things can fall out, so I'm opting to put just a very small piece of fuel tube over there. Now, the other thing about these thumb screws, when you put them in, if I can angle you guys, once this thing is in there, they stick out more than my liking. I'm going to trim maybe about 3/8 of an inch off of this thing to get this part closer to the fuselage. It's just an aesthetics. It's just my preference in the way I prefer my looks. So I'm going to cut about 3/8 of an inch off of that one, and then we apply that fuel tubing. Now you can also go down the road if you wanted to use a little bit of epoxy on the inside of there when you put those on, so that way they don't come loose from them thumb screws, and like in case you're taking the wings off, lose them or something like that. So a couple good tidbits there. We're going to have a lot here to do all at one time, but let's get to it. We're going to go ahead and put just a little bit of Vaseline here on these threads, just because while they're up in there, we don't want them to get any type of epoxy on them. And do the same thing here with our uppers. All right, now you can see that these longer pieces, I drilled 2 small holes and I roughed them all up, and then I roughed up the just the one end of everything that's going to get tucked down into the wing. So we're going to epoxy everything, slide it together, and see if we'll have enough time to adjust angles there and let stuff harden up. So let's give it a shot. All right, let me show you what I opted to do ultimately and why I chose to do it. So number one, my initial thought process was I could put all of those wing bolts in there and just slide everything together and let it dry. The problem is the weight of this wing assembly, even pulling on those carbon tubes a little bit, it wants to pull out, and my fear is that these pieces won't be in where they were supposed to be. So what I opted to do is I put the jig in here and I attach it with the rubber band, so I know that that wing position is as prescribed. And then I went ahead and also put this bracket in there, and I just wiped a little bit of Vaseline around the wood, so that way I know that none of this sticks together when I want to take it back apart. And I am going to paint that edges on there. You know, I think they could have done a better job with that. But anyway, I think this is going to be good this way. And then I know that that bracket is in there with a square. It's nice and straight. And honestly, I'm just going to let it sit here like this and cure. And then that way, at least I know wing panel is supported by the carbon rod, and that I know everything is square and in alignment. And I'm just going to let this stuff sit there and dry, but I know that everything is now going to line up. Ain't going to have any issues with any of that. So let's go ahead and repeat this on the other side, and then we're going to let it sit overnight. So check out this insanity. Now, I know slightly more aggravating than the way the instructions are laid out, but there's a purpose to this. So look at these wing supports. Perfect fit, perfect fit, perfect fit, perfect fit. You look at the wing saddle, perfect fit. You look at that, perfect fit. All right, now here's the scary thing if you're not watching. So the wing bolts come up. You guys hopefully can see that without being too bright in the camera, right there. And you know it's attached because you glued that piece in the wing. That piece is a little bit too long, and what it does is it prevents the front of the wing from sitting all the way into that saddle. You could see it in that little window right there and on the other side. And the reason I'm going to recommend that you guys do it this way with the slow epoxy and putting everything together. Is simply, I had time to slide the wings back apart, take that black thing out, trim it down, put it back in, and then I can now flip this here and look at everything, make sure it sits all the way in and everything is flush and sits right. Those wings are all the way in straight and sitting on the saddles up top here as well. I know that by doing things the way I am, that is as perfect as a seam as I'm going to get right there. It's not going to get any better here, nor at those wing struts or anywhere else. Everything is sitting together, and now it can cure. Once all that cures, I'll go ahead and I'll take those pieces out and take them off here, glue them in there with slow epoxy, put it all back together again, and now I will let them sit and cure. And guys, everything's going to be made to fit instead of just gluing pieces together and hoping stuff fits. You know, this is just one of those things that comes down to a lot of years of modeling and how to make things fit together better and easier. Do it this way. Buy yourself a bag of rubber bands. I just use the pressure to hold them there. I use pressure from here over the other one to hold those, squeeze those together. And around the outside here, I put rubber bands initially to support it till I got zip ties around there. And they're not super tight. You know, I'm not crushing the wood. They're just there to help hold things in place. While all that epoxy sits in there and dries, I could take everything off and everything will be a absolutely perfect fit. While the wings are drying, try not to disturb the plane too much, but I'm going to install some pieces and try and get the front motor assembly in. First thing I notice is that hole is a little bit bigger than this pipe is, and it's not a super desirable look around there. So what I'm going to do is I put a piece of tape on the inside. We're going to go ahead and just kind of puncture this a little bit. And now when I slide this thing in, that tape is going to seal around the bottom side. And I'm going to mix a little bit of black paint in with my epoxy. And I'm going to fill in all around the edges of the pipe so it looks a little better. Let's go ahead and get the rubber wrapped around the edge, and then we'll start to get the motor mounted up. Well, I just tried fixing the wife's desktop TV and broke that. It had a bug between the screen. Well, I'm definitely not a TV repair guy. Let's get back to stuff I know a little bit more about. So this thing is set up overnight. All of the epoxy is definitely solidified in here. We're going to start cutting all this stuff off. Now, just so you guys know, these braces in there are used, and it doesn't tell you that, they're used for transport as well, because now it looks like what'll happen if you want to transport this model, all you simply have to do is take the wing bolts out and these wing sections will slide off. This will support this side, but there's nothing to support this side. So you just put this back in and then you have a chunk of a wing and another chunk of a wing. So pretty easy to disassemble and take this thing with you. Now, how that's going to work with the flying wires, well, let's see. Now that we have the wings off, now we're going to go ahead and pop off this top section, or if I have to, I'll loosen the screws here and just take the whole assembly off so I could slide those out, put it all back together, put the wings back on this thing, and then let the glue joints up here adhere. And I'll do the same thing with those metal tabs. We're going to rough those up before I put them back in. We'll take a file or a grinder to them just so that way the epoxy has something to attach on to. But the angles of these things, there's a good amount of tension there holding that, but we're not going to let it go that way. It's going to be epoxied as they call for in the book. So let's see if we have to take screws out or if this will just pop off. Let's get it epoxied in and set back up. So these support struts already have holes in them, so I don't need to do a whole lot to it. The epoxy is going to sit in there, and then there are some little grooves there, so that will be more than enough to hold that in. Also, I hope you guys can see it. Look how good that back filling of that black epoxy looks. I hope that turns out in the camera, but that looks phenomenal, and there's no space in there. Now, before I get into the process of gluing those on, because the wings will be on again for a day and I don't want to lose a day, I want to change these connectors out because I hate dealing with those little slide over locks. Since the wings probably will be coming on and off, I like using the Dancing Hobby's polarized locking connectors. So I'm going to swap those out, and then I am going to make the other end pigtails so they just stick up through the fuselage. So that way that stuff will be done and I continue to work on motor wiring and electronics and flying wires while the wing set is in. And now you can see the wing lock connector that I'll have has that locking tab and a positive click to it. So you know, once it's in, it's in. While I have the epoxy out, I'm just going to go ahead and glue this dashboard back in. That'll save me from having to get it out later. So we're just going to apply a little bit of epoxy as we slide this thing in. You can see where it's going to rest there on those former mounts just on the sides. Let's go ahead and throw that in. So these flying wires are a ton of work, but God, do they look good. I mean, they're about as full functioning as you could want, providing you put those in correctly. So I'm almost debating I may go with a little bit longer bolts than what they recommended their screws, but I mean, I put some tension on these suckers and they're good. So let's talk about how this stuff should be done. Number one, doing these flying wires, you guys really need to make sure that you're not using diagonal cutters to crimp. Get yourself a real pair of the cable coupler crimpers. These things work great, and I got these from Balsa, USA. Doing lots of flying wires on different planes. So anyway, let's start off with number one. We used a flashlight trick from the inside of the fuse to see those blocks, so you could see those things really well. I knew exactly where to drill. Now, this is 2. Each one of those runs up into an eyelet right there. Now, for here in the front of these cabane struts, so you have this one that goes up to the back one, comes down through here, loops, comes back through the front one, and comes back down again. So they cross, but this is 1 cable, 2 cable, 3 cable, and in the back we have 4 cables, 5 cables. That those back ones look just like the front one, but these come up and cross. Guys, that's a really nice setup right there. I mean, number one, it's going to be fairly functional. With this is my only questionable spot. If you harden those blocks like you're supposed to, that should be fine there. But they look good. That's a lot of nice cable they gave us. We're going to be using the same stuff for the pull when we put it in, but we have one more side to do. But ultimately, I'm really happy with the way these turned out. I love the look of it. So let's get to the other side, and we'll time lapse this one. I wanted to do this one so I wasn't drawing out a time lapse and just really kind of see how everything looked. But you know, all of those cables and crimps and stuff, all that stuff turned out really, really nice. They give you some nice hardware. Here's another quick tip for you. When you're starting to put in your wires, make sure that these are backed about all the way out, so that way you can tighten them down and keep the tension on the cables, especially as they stretch over time. And there you have it, guys. That wraps up part 2 of the build of the Dancing Wings Pt17 Stearman from Bitgo Hobby. If you're interested in this model or any of the other products from the Dancing Wing line, head on over to www.bitgohobby.com. Check out the Dancing Wing line. Check out the other foam aircraft and other things that they have there on their websites. I also saw tanks over there if you're into that. Go over and check them out. Link down in the description below. With that being said, if you appreciate it and like the build, do me a favor, smash that thumbs up. If you're going to hit the thumbs down, do that baby twice for me. Like, share, subscribe, all that shameless stuff that I always ask for. With that being said, it's Brendan here at Just Plain Crazy. You guys are just plain crazy for watching. I appreciate every one of you hanging out and checking out my vids. With that being said, I wish you guys happy flights. Peace out.